Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of our leadership team here at America at a Crossroads. Along with me are former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Welcome and many thanks to our guest tonight, Marc Dunkelman, and to Larry Mantle for joining us to discuss the USA, a topic we can relate to, why nothing is working and how to fix it. And boy, would we all love that. We'd all love to know how to do that. So hopefully we'll get a little smarter tonight. Next week on July 2nd, that's July 2, next Wednesday, we have a topic that is not unique to Southern California, even though some of you might think it is. It is not. There is an issue across the United States with federal troops coming into cities and states against the wishes of mayors and governors. It's happening beyond Los Angeles. Los Angeles was just most prominent because of the volume of troops that were engaged. The other day, there was a critical court ruling which allowed President Trump to maintain control of the National Guard in Los Angeles and in California, despite efforts by our elected leaders to not have that happen. We will delve into that issue next week as we welcome Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who will be in conversation with Madeline Brand on the topic Federal Troops in Our American Cities, What Comes Next? We hope that you'll join us. It should be a very interesting conversation. And a reminder, you can watch after the fact via podcast or via YouTube. All the info and all the links you need for both of those are in all of our emails, and you can always email us and we answer. You know that. Now, without further ado, please welcome tonight's outstanding moderator, whom our America at a Crossroads audience knows well. Larry Mantle is an iconic Southern California treasure, and now he has the same status with our America at a Crossroads audience. As you know, Larry is the host of the longest running talk show probably anywhere in the world, but certainly on NPR's local affiliate, LAist. It's been 40 years, and he just celebrated his 40th anniversary with Air Talk. He is a first-class journalist and a first-class mensch. Larry, the show is yours.
Janice, thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's always an honor to be with you. Thank you, Mel and Zev as well. These America at a Crossroads programs have been extraordinary for now more than 5 years. I've been honored to be a part of it. And I loved, for those of you that were on the program early, you heard Janice reading off all the locations across the country and internationally who view these programs live. And that doesn't even count all the people who will be listening to the podcast or watching it on YouTube. We have many thousands more who enjoy these programs later. So make sure to share with your friends about them. If you have people you think at all might be interested, maybe aren't aware of America at a Crossroads, please encourage them to view the programs either live or the archived programs later on. Extraordinary to know the reach, all the people from around the world who are watching these programs. I thought that we might have journeyed past these crossroads of America when we started the series, and Janice, David, Mel, and Zeb started this back in 2020. But of course, we still face this crossroads in these very difficult times in our nation. And one of the challenges we face is how to accomplish major undertakings, things that we've been so good at a country historically. I'm sitting in the greater Los Angeles area where William Mulholland built a massive aqueduct to be able to bring water from the Sierra Nevada to Southern California to allow for a massive population growth in the 20th century of greater Los Angeles. So many other major projects like the interstate highway system, the freeways of California. But of course, California, like other states, is challenged to keep that infrastructure working. It is in some places literally crumbling. And if you look at California's high-speed rail project, how fraught that's been, you see how challenging it is for us to do big things. Well, we're so pleased to have with us Marc J. Dunkelman, who's a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. He was previously at NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management. Marc was a senior fellow at the Clinton Foundation, and he worked for Democratic members of the House and Senate. He's here to talk with us about his recently published book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back. Marc, welcome to America at a Crossroads.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thrilled to be here.
As you point out very early on in your book, progressives and liberals often blame conservatives for impeding proposals to expand government, to impeding the ambitions and the programs that might be created by government. You write that that blame is partly deserved, but the progressives themselves have hamstrung government. How so?
Well, the story begins a long time ago. Uh, for the first two-thirds of the 20th century, really from the end of the 1800s through the 1960s and 70s, progressivism had a story in its head that power in America was too diffused, and that to solve big problems, big tragedies of the common, we needed to put power in the hands of scientifically oriented, sort of responsible, serious people like William Mulholland or like Robert Moses in New York City. That there was a sense that we needed to empower the establishment to do big things. And they did big things over the course of those decades, from the New Deal to the Great Society, before and a little bit after. And then something happened in the late 60s and early 70s where progressives themselves began to look at the projects that had been accomplished and looked at the generally white men who had led those projects and made the discretionary decisions about where a highway would go or how a neighborhood would be affected by a housing project, and thought to themselves, I don't trust these guys anymore. I don't think they're doing the right thing. I think they're making self-interested decisions, and I think often their decisions are wrong. And you could see that in all sorts of ways. You saw it in the fact that the agriculture industry sprayed DDT on crops and it caused terrible birth defects. That was sort of an establishment associated decision. Ralph Nader noticed that cars were being produced and put out onto the streets unsafe at any speed because the establishment had allowed the industry to do that. The establishment did urban renewal. The establishment sent us to Vietnam. The establishment built all these terrible highways that people didn't like. The establishment was the plumbers in Watergate. And so you get to the mid 1970s, and the notion is that the old story among progressives, that the problem was that power was too diffused, had evolved to a notion that the problem was exactly the opposite. The problem was that this establishment, unimpeachable, unaccountable, turning a deaf ear to ordinary citizens, needed to be sort of put back in a box. And so we have spent, as a movement, the last 50 or 60 years thinking of ways to create procedures that would stop the establishment from imposing its will coercively on ordinary people.
You write a lot about Robert Moses, who actually we have some fond feelings in Southern California. The Dodgers are here because Moses wouldn't allow Walter O'Malley to build the stadium where the arena is now, where the Brooklyn Nets play basketball. So O'Malley moved to LA, but certainly understand from Robert Cowrose, the power broker, the fraught history of Moses. But going back to my reference to William Mulholland, the engineer responsible for Southern California's water program, he was able essentially to run roughshod over the Owens Valley, take its water, harmed indigenous communities, the farmers of the Owens Valley, the residents there, because there really was no way for them to combat the power, even of a much smaller Los Angeles at that point, once they bought up the land and the aqueduct was under construction. But it did enable the building of this impressive water project that we here rely on even to this day. So it's another example. There are always trade-offs involved in
Yeah.
mega. Someone gives up something so that another group gets it. Los Angeles is able to grow and be built because the Owens Valley suffered so that we in Southern California could gain. And I just wonder, given our greater understanding now of what's suffering, what the trade-offs are that come from the projects, how do you get past that inertia to actually build big things that are going to hurt some people?
Well, you and I are now talking about two extremes, right? We're talking about it. One extreme is a system whereby a Robert Moses figure, a William Mulholland figure, Richard Daley in Chicago, every city had a series of establishment figures, city fathers, who could sort of bend the world to their will for a time and made these trade-offs in their own image, what they preferred to have done. And that's the system that prevailed for decades across America, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. That was the way things were done for 50, 60, 70 years. We're now 50 years past that switch. The Power Broker came out in 1974, which exposed Robert Moses for all he'd done to New York and really blamed him. At the time, New York City was in a pretty tough spot, blamed him for the fact that New York was failing. It's almost at exactly that same time that the movie Chinatown came out. In Chinatown, the villain is sort of based broadly, I think, on William Mulholland, and he's truly a villain who has done exactly as you say, and the story in our heads changes to a situation where you want to put guardrails around the establishment. So we create environmental laws and historical preservation laws and new rights to sue and Endangered Species Act and you sort of name it, zoning laws, all sorts of new checks that would make it so that a William Mulholland, a Robert Moses, even if they were alive today, even by the force of their personality, they wouldn't be able to do today what they had done back then. And we've now gone from the one extreme where William Mulholland could do whatever he liked in Southern California to the other extreme where almost no one, no matter how worthy the project, can get it moving because any one of any multitude of objections stands in its way, or the potential for an objection makes it so that someone who might propose a project just decides to give it up.
You write about this aspect too, and I think it's an important one that you mention. Progressivism today, in large part, gives the underdog, the less empowered, moral high ground, even if the rational arguments aren't as strong from the person with less power. So how do you, sort of given that elite status of people who have less power in the progressive world, how then do you keep people from being able to have veto power, who might not really speak for the majority, might not speak for the best interests of the greatest number of people, but have that sort of position of sympathy and elevation within the progressive community?
Well, I think we need to build systems in America that are some modulation of these two extremes. So we want to have a system where people have a voice, which they did not have with William Mulholland, but they don't have a veto, which is what they currently enjoy. You want to have a system where if the the high-speed rail line is going to go through your neighborhood and you don't like it, or someone's going to build a multifamily home at the lot next to yours, which was previously just for a single family home, or there's a way to get clean power from one place to another, and it means building a high voltage line near your child's school. You have an opportunity to voice your concerns to the person who is going to make the decision about whether the project goes forward. But you don't have a veto. If that person should weigh your concerns, right? Those concerns of the local person who objects should be heard. Robert Moses wasn't listening. William Mulholland wasn't listening. Those concerns should be heard. They just shouldn't have the weight of a veto because it may be that yes, a certain species of orchid is going to be denigrated, even if it's endangered in northern Maine, when you're trying to build a power line. But the power line will make it so that the power in the Massachusetts grid can be generated by hydropower rather than fossil fuel burning generation. And that's probably worth it, right? An orchid species, beautiful as it may be, is not worth 700,000 additional cars on the street every year. In my humble estimation, or the humble estimation of whoever should be empowered to make that decision. The problem today for progressives is that power is so diffused that there is no one empowered to make these decisions. that,
Give and
yeah.
let's talk about that because you write beautifully about that the whole conundrum over the power, coming from Maine, from Canada, the hydroelectric power, and all the different interests. It just looked like it was to the finish line, and then it gets tripped up, and then they just build it up to the finish line, and it gets tripped up. It's quite a dramatic account that you give. So, how ultimately did it resolve?
It's not still not resolved. There are rumors today to this day. So the issue, you're absolutely right. The issue is that in 2016, so nearly a decade ago, the Republican governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, signed a bill that basically authorized Massachusetts to buy clean energy from Quebec. But of course, Massachusetts and Quebec don't touch. So you need to build a high-speed rail line through either New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, or Maine. New Hampshire looks at it and then they realize that the line is going to go through the White Mountains. So they say no. So then basically Massachusetts offers to buy Maine off with incredible amounts of money. Subsidies are going to be all sorts of benefits to Mainers and also jobs for Mainers who would build this line. But there are interests that don't want the line to come through. Some of them are interested in the preservation of the forests in northern Maine. Some of them are localities that don't want the line to be near them. Some of them are there's sort of a feeling that the rich people down in Massachusetts are taking advantage of the of the bumpkin Mainers, or that Mainers believe that the Massachusetts folks view them as bumpkins. So that you get all of these sort of dynamics to come, and we can all argue about the merits, but there is no person who is individually deciding, I've looked at all of these considerations, the impacts on the local communities, the money, the impacts on the Appalachian Trail or this gorge or the views from here. There are a gazillion. I mean, you're talking about a long new power line. There are lots of implications and lots of people with concerns, and they'd rather go 1 mile this way or 1 mile that way. Ultimately, what Robert Moses and William Holland had, whatever it was 70 years ago, 80 years ago, was the power to decide. And now there is no power to decide. That power has been so thoroughly diffused that no one can decide to move things forward.
So you've got elected representatives, each who have different constituencies, some who might be financially supported by fossil fuel companies who don't want the hydropower to come to Massachusetts. You've got others that are, supported by labor unions that want a big project, or and others that are concerned about job losses at fossil fuel plant. You've got others that tourism has their ear. So all these elected officials are listening to different masters, so to speak. How would you come up with someone empowered to take all this input, to do what many of us do as individuals, make two columns on a paper? Here are the pros, here are
Sure.
the cons, here's the greater good. How would you get to having that person who isn't running roughshod a la a Moses to make that call?
I mean, there are all sorts of models for this, right? Like right at the turn of the 20th century, when you had the imposition of these big, huge trusts and railroads and whatnot, progressivism was divided on how to handle this. On one side were people who thought that the solution would be through antitrust, so breaking up the big corporations so that we could go back to sort of the old 19th century economy of small businesses. And others wanted to create big, huge bureaucracies that would oversee these big companies and make sure that they were doing the right thing and weren't overcharging passengers or freight or weren't abusing the people who had been giving them license to run their trains through a town in Ohio or Pennsylvania or wherever it was. And what we need today is once again to create the sorts of institutions, whether it's a blue ribbon institution, whether it's a public utility commission, whether it's a just an elected official, ultimately who decides. You need to figure out who ultimately has the decision-making power. You know, I often, when I talk about the book, I often bring up the fact that, on Friday nights, I have two daughters and a wife, and when my daughters were younger, they would come home from school, and my wife would return home from work, and neither she nor I wanted to cook, and so we'd sort of say, "Look, why don't we go out tonight?" And then you had the two of us and, daughters 11 and 8, all having to have a discussion about where to have dinner. And like, that's a pretty messy process, right? Everyone's got a different opinion. The 11-year-old wants to, go to a fried chicken restaurant, hold the chicken part. And the 8-year-old just wants donuts. And my wife wants, unseasoned quinoa at a new place down the street or whatever it is. And you have to pick a process for deciding how you select your restaurant. And like, there's still politics there per se. I mean, there's lots of politics in a family, but there's no right or wrong answer. Should the mom always get to decide? Should the parents always get to decide? Should everyone get a choice, each consecutive week so that, next week the younger daughter will decide and we'll go get donuts for dinner, right? Or should everybody get to put out an idea and everyone else can veto? It is this is what government is supposed to do. And so we've done it in the past. This is not a new American phenomenon that we have people disagreeing about what we should invest in. We can have a process where someone is ultimately responsible.
I look at the state of California, which to me is a fascinating laboratory because you have a Democratic supermajority in the state legislature. And you have a high percentage of those Democrats whose major donors are labor unions, public employee unions, but also some in the private sector, nurses, other groups, who are very influential with California lawmakers because they turn out the vote, they organize, they have a lot of volunteers and a lot of money to spend on candidates' races. And even with that supermajority, you see factionalism within California Democrats. You see difficulty taking on big projects. The high-speed rail project has been, to this point, a total debacle with the cost soaring out of control. And even with its reduced ambitions, even that's delayed many years until even the segment of the Central Valley is covered with the high-speed rail project. So, free marketers say, well, this is exhibit A of why government really can't and shouldn't do these things. The Bright Line, which is going to be built largely with private investor dollars, is way ahead of the game in building a high-speed rail from Las Vegas to the Inland Empire of Southern California. That's the model they say we should take. Let the private sector take the risk and build these things. Private sector wouldn't build a high-speed rail connecting Northern and Southern California because the risk is too great. Just what did happen would have happened with private investors. So what's your response to that you think government should do these projects?
Well, I think that the two projects you mentioned, the one from Rancho Cucamonga to Las Vegas and the high-speed rail between LA and San Francisco are just two fundamentally different projects. And you could have government or the private sector handle either one of them, and they come up against the same challenges, right? The way to make high-speed rail is to have a straight line, don't have turns, right? That's when trains get up to their top speed is when they're on a straightaway. And so if you're going to have a straightaway, it means you're going to cut through more communities. And so the problem with getting between LA and San Francisco is that there's so many places that you wouldn't want to cut through. Right? It's either very expensive or you have to build a very expensive underpass or an overpass. You can't cut through a very nice suburb or maybe even not a particularly expensive suburb. People don't want their communities bisected by a rail line. That's not a that the ability to veto that project is not born of whether the person proposing it is a private sector company or Amtrak or a California utility. That doesn't matter. What matters is that there is so much power wielded by the people who would be inconvenienced. And that's always the case. And I want to stress this. That's not that's not born of some evil. That's born of some notion that generations earlier, William Mulholland was able to build his viaduct, and really that caused terrible abuse to communities that couldn't speak up for themselves. And we've simply overcorrected for trying to withhold opportunities for powerful people to do that. You need to find some sort of compromise, some sort of middle ground where these people who would be impacted by a project like high-speed rail have a voice but aren't able to veto it.
And I'm just wondering, how you do that. I think of the interstate, Route 66, famously bypassed by Interstate 40 for the most part. And those communities devastated. Now, some of them come back with a little bit of Route 66 history, tourism, but Interstate 40 fundamentally changed a significant portion of the middle of the country. And that's true of Interstates 10 and others as well. In California, we have freeways that have bisected communities. I'm not far from one that devastated a historic African American community in Pasadena to build an interstate through it. So everybody gets the benefit of that who commutes to work every day. It's clear benefit to many more people, but also did, severe damage to a historic community. I don't know what the middle ground would be. How would you work around that today to hit that compromise you're talking about?
Well, I think you would. First of all, we need to acknowledge that these are two competing goods, right? There's a benefit to trying to do big projects, to make us more mobile, to green the economy, to build more housing so that housing is less expensive. All these things are things that we as a whole support. There's also a benefit to protecting communities that don't want the housing built in their neck of the woods, that don't want the highway built through their particular main street, that don't want the high voltage transmission line to be near their children's elementary school. Those are two competing sets of goods. And the challenge of democratic government is to create a situation where it's not always yes and it's not always no, where there is some thoughtful weighing of the various trade-offs. And what we've had was one system in back for the most of the 20th century where there was almost no weighing of the trade-offs. There was no consideration of the communities that were going to be affected or the environmental impacts or the historic buildings that might be demolished. And on the other hand, we've got a system today where no one is empowered to, to say yes, right?
How
Um, because anyone who has an objection is powerful enough to veto it. And so,
how do other
yeah,
places do this, Mark? Because you give some examples in the book of ways of share one of the examples of places that approach this, finding this middle ground of hearing input, but someone or somebody has to make a decision in the greater public good.
I mean, the classic example in my mind is actually in criminal justice. They've created a system called drug courts, and it's been around for a while now. And the notion is that you get caught with a illegal substance, and you go to court, and there's a mandatory minimum, and you're going to spend time in jail, and there's going to be very little rehabilitation. But you can be diverted into a drug court where you see a alternative judge who makes new requirements. You have to go to work. You have to breathe into a breathalyzer. You have to be tested. You have to maintain a certain income. You have to stay in your home, et cetera. Sets up a series of goals that you need to meet, else you be placed back into the criminal justice system. So I just I want I think most people will have some notion that in their town and their history and their own experience, there are moments where you trust some individual to make a decision that is going to be painful for some and beneficial for the community as a whole. Whether that's the mayor, whether that's a blue ribbon commission, whether that's an elected official, an appointed official, an expert. And we're so nervous about William Mulholland and Robert Moses coming back to life that we haven't yet embraced it.
Mark, let's talk about the bias of experts because so many professions in which you've got specialized expertise attract people who have a particular worldview and that may not be comprehensive. I'm thinking of, urban planners, for example, so many of whom favor transit-oriented villages with particular types of, apartment buildings around transit. And And they come out of schools that advocate for the same kind of design. And not that there's anything against that. Those can work extremely well and get more people to ride public transit, but they don't always. You end up often with people still driving their cars. They want to be in that hub because it's a cool place to be in their restaurants and nightlife and people on the streets, but they still drive to and from work. So when you've got panels of experts that kind of come out with a form of groupthink, how 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 do you avoid the decision makers pushing us to a world that doesn't really embody the diversity of views that are there?
Well, that's a terrific question, and I haven't come across it before. I think that that's actually where democracy comes in, is that you want to have appointed experts who ultimately are responsible to elected officials. And if you've got people who are ideologues and experts in the housing department of your local city who have a certain view of multifamily homes and how the community should work, and it's not working, then it should be up to the mayor or the city council to deal with that. So you want to have a balance of those experts. You also don't want to have a tragedy of the common, right? The alternative to the nightmare you just described, where you've got experts who have a certain group think and only want one sort of thing that isn't actually publicly popular, is you have a situation where everybody says, yes, we need more housing in California or in whatever part of the country you're in or anywhere in the world. And there's a global housing shortage at this point, but nobody wants the housing to be built near them, right? Everybody has the power to wield a veto about the lot that's, 3 doors down, where it was originally zoned for single family homes, and someone wants to build a duplex or a triplex or a small apartment building. And that's where you have truly a tragedy of the common, because probably the people that are saying, no, no, you can't build that there. We don't have enough capacity on the roads. It's gonna drain the local sewage and water system. We don't have the capacity for more housing here, but everybody wants it somewhere else. And so you have to weigh those concerns. Who ultimately the question is, who is the person that you want weighing those trade-offs? You don't want, the same ticky-tacky uh, homes to be built everywhere per urban planners who have a certain view of transit and whatnot. You also don't want it to be that everyone can veto all the housing near them with the expectation that some other community will welcome it. And so you need ultimately to empower someone to make the decision.
And you don't want developers running roughshod over communities with whatever's just profitable necessarily, because that's not necessarily in the public interest, too. Let me ask a listener or viewer question here. Rena asks if those affected by major projects don't have the ability to veto it, if they can't get to that critical mass, then what power do they have at all?
Well, this is the central problem of American democracy, right? This is the very thing that Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton were arguing about now nearly 250 years ago, which is that Thomas Jefferson had exactly that same fear, which was that ordinary people, in his case, yeoman farmers, would be run over roughshod by a very powerful centralized government. And he wanted to empower the people who lived on their farms to be able to manage their properties and their communities as they liked. And on the other hand, Alexander Hamilton, who saw America as a Hercules in the cradle, wanted to make sure that the country could reach its full potential for as many people as possible, and that required ordinary people giving up some sort of their own power so that someone could make a decision in the public interest. And we are constantly, as Americans, trying to negotiate between these two poles. So you are right that if you give someone decision-making power about whether the highway or the rail line or the housing project or the transmission line is going to be built, you need to withhold from the local community ultimately the ability to veto the project as a whole. So the question is, who should decide on California high-speed rail if the rail has to go through one farmer or one series of farms somewhere, up the up the coast between the two cities, and those farmers don't want the line to bisect their farms, and it will affect their livelihoods and maybe the real sale value of their real estate. Like, it could have a really negative impact on their own situations. Is that worth giving up the benefit of having a high-speed connection between these two places so that fewer people are driving and fewer people are taking a plane? Someone needs to be able to ratify a trade-off in that case. It can't be that every person who owns a piece of land in between those two places can veto the project as a whole.
And it's often not the property owners, it's, let's say, an environmental organization that's they have very real concerns. But it doesn't necessarily mean, even though it's a real concern, you mentioned the orchid, in Maine or whatever, that should counterbalance a larger public good, perhaps. So it isn't necessarily just a property owner, but a group of people that might be empowered and have financial backing, and we're going to withhold support for you, elected official, if and I just picked because in California there are environmental organizations that are extremely effective and well backed and have a lot of clout. So that is even a bigger issue than the single property owner, and it's hard because that clout can be strong political leverage in a state like California.
Absolutely. I mean, there's there's a dream that progressives have held on to now for 50 or 60 years, that we will find a procedure for making big public decisions that will satisfy everyone. If you go to a think tank report published on public infrastructure over the course of the last 50 years, pull it out of the archives of whatever think tank you want, almost guarantee you that one among the first three recommendations will be to tell the public early, right? Go to the community and tell them what your plans are so that they can participate, so that they can say, these are our concerns. This is what we would want if you're going to build this through our neighborhood. It's just universal. Like, everyone says that. And the presumption, sort of the underlying subtle presumption in that recommendation, is that if you go to people early, they can be convinced that the public good outweighs their own personal pique about some proposal, or that there's some route that will satisfy everyone. That if we just all get together around a table or in a forum and someone says, I don't think it should go here because it's going to affect this stream, and someone else says, I don't think it should go here because it's going to affect this neighborhood, whatever it is, that we will eventually have a deliberative process that renders some sort of decision that costs nothing to anybody, where everyone is satisfied. That's just not the world that we live in. All of these big projects require trade-offs, and someone has to look at it from above and make a decision that some people are going to be unhappy with.
Mark, we've had a number of viewers who have expressed concern about what they see as President Trump's overreach through executive orders, trying to, essentially bend public policy and the law to his will. So they wonder about, well, then where are the guardrails, and how do you deal? You may have the person who's in the leadership position, whether the president or someone else who you think is responsibly using that authority, and someone like many of our viewers who think Trump is irresponsibly attempting to even amass greater authority. So how do you rein in overreach?
So I'd like to turn that around for a second. I think that the reason that the country turned to President Trump is that they felt as though government wasn't working. There wasn't enough housing. Housing is too expensive. Infrastructure is falling apart. Things aren't moving. Things aren't changing. Prosperity isn't being enhanced. Their faith in government has fallen. And in that situation, the thing that you want, seeing government so betwixt and between, so vexed against itself, is someone who's just going to come through and hammer. And that was Trump's underlying appeal. For all the stuff about xenophobia and sexism, all the things that those of us who voted for Harris and who were aghast when Trump was elected again and elected the first time, for all the things that we don't like about him, his underlying appeal is that he's just going to saw through a broken institution. He's going to saw through the deep state. That's what Doge was an attempt to push out this incompetent bureaucracy. And so before we start worrying about what Trump will do, which is a legitimate worry, what he would do with more executive authority, we need to sort of recognize the degree to which government wasn't working, and that set the tenor for the campaign that allowed him to win. I think that if government were working more expeditiously, if we were making the decisions, if there was enough housing, if we were getting the clean energy faster, if the economy was humming in different parts of the country, I think that Trump's appeal diminishes. And so rather than say, because of Trump, I think we should further lasso public authority, I would say you need to let public authority churn some so that people aren't uh, inclined to vote for Trump.
Jim asks, aren't the Peter Thiels, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, Donald Trump, isn't this an example of the new Moses or Mulholland or Daley? You certainly look at what Bezos has built. You look at what Musk has built, for example. Are they comparable in your view?
Well, I mean, no. If you read the first few, if you read the introduction of the Power Broker and see what Robert Moses did to reshape the landscape of New York City, it's still orders of magnitude more impressive than even the most impressive things Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have done, flying rocket ships into space, what have you, building an infrastructure network like Amazon's, or a car company like Uber. Um, the distinction is that Moses's and Mulholland's fiat of power was public power, not private power. There have long been titans in American history, the Rockefellers, right? The Carnegies, like that. That's not a new phenomenon. The shift that has happened between sort of the 1960s and the 1970s and last with us today is a view that the progressive mantra should be speak truth to power in all situations, because that is certainly part of progressivism and an important part of progressivism. And we don't want bureaucrats telling women what they can and can't do with their bodies. Like that's an endeavor. We do want to push that power down to ordinary citizens. But when it comes to linear infrastructure or housing, or sort of the ways that we live, we need a process by which someone has the discretion to push through a good project, even if some people object.
Margaret and Eric ask, who should decide what is in the greater good? Should it be everything is voted on by the public? Is this the job for the legislature? Because so often the legislatures refuse to take on tough issues, as Margaret and Eric say, so nothing gets done.
Well, I mean, we have bureaucracies that have been empowered in our past to make these decisions. There are public utility commissions born of the progressive era at the turn of the 20th century that make choices on what rates can be charged for electricity or for water. We have had, the Tennessee Valley Authority was a three-person commission when it was first ordained in the beginning of the New Deal, and one of those three commissioners, a guy named David Lilienthal, who was sort of a young lawyer from Wisconsin, basically was the Raj in the upper South of America. He built wires and canals and reforested whole areas and took land from people, basically without anybody being able to say no. I think that that's too much power. But I do think ultimately these are decisions that should be made by responsible bodies within the executive branch of government. I don't think that we want legislators doing it because then suddenly you've got an earmarked bill where everyone's just doing their pet project. I certainly don't think what the current system is, it ends up being decided by judges on the basis of law rather than on policy. So that they ultimately, for instance, congestion pricing in New York City was going to be decided by a judge, rather than by whom? By the president, by the mayor, by the governor, by the chairman of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. It wasn't entirely clear, but it will vary from venue to venue. Generally, though, when the public asks who is going to decide, we ought to have an answer. That's, I
And
think, yeah.
it is this, I'm not knowledgeable enough about state constitutions to know the answer to this, but could governors be in this position, or is that in the division of state power that's typically set up in a state constitution not workable to allow a governor to have that level of executive authority over a major infrastructure project?
Well, you could imagine doing it in a whole series of different ways. You could have commissions. You could have the governor appoints three people who he or she could fire. You could have people set on set terms. You have the Federal Reserve, which sets interest rates, and people have certain terms on the right. I mean, you could imagine a whole series. I mean, this is beyond the scope of my book, just insofar as I wanted to point out that this is a tension, which I think we progressives too too frequently fail to acknowledge or consider. Like we don't think to ourselves that we both want to empower centralized authority to do big things, and we are worried about coercive centralized power. Like that's a tension we all hold within ourselves and are constantly revisiting, and trying to weigh. I think, I'm sure that everyone on the call who's listening to this right now would have some sort of preference as to how you would organize exactly the right balance. Who would be on the panel that decides whether to build the highway project or the housing project or the clean infrastructure project? What and
Su-
how those things should be weighed. Um, but the point is right now that mechanism does not yet exist. So I think we should have a robust public debate about how it should exist. But right now, the reflexive fear among progressives in particular is we're so frightened of a corrupt public official or a venal public official or a Trump sort of public official do anything that we are going to further hamstring government. And the more we hamstring government, the more we're going to sort of invite people who are frustrated by government's incompetence to vote for people who are MAGA-esque.
Susan asks, is our form of federalist democracy outdated, unable to solve the problems we face that an autocracy could deal with more efficiently?
Well, certainly an autocracy or dictatorship could deal with all of these things more efficiently, right? I mean, that's the Chinese model that, Xi Jinping decides that they're going to build a new factory somewhere, and everyone who lives there is simply evicted the next day. There's no mechanism for anyone to have their parochial concerns reconsidered. That's the hallmark of it. I think what's interesting about American history, and I was going to save this for my closing remark, but I'll say it now. At the turn of the 20th century, we lived in what they call the Lochner era. And it was an era where the federal judiciary was extremely powerful and extremely reticent to allow the executive and legislative branches to get involved in the economy. It was sort of a hands-off. They were called the Four Horsemen, were four conservative 19th century justices who sat on the Supreme Court for a long time. And, they were the ones who originally struck down portions of the New Deal. But they sat there for just decades, poo-pooing minimum wages and all sorts of progressive legislation. And there's a house in Washington on 19th Street called the House of Truth. It's where Felix Frankfurter and Walter Lippmann and a whole bunch of progressives lived in the early 20th century. And they sat up late talking in their frustrations about how these justices just wouldn't let government sing. They had big ideas for how great America could be if government could simply do things. And they sat there and they couldn't imagine a situation in which government would ever get out from under these conservative justices. Well, sure enough, 50 years later, you've got William Mulholland and Robert Moses and Richard Daley and all these people who are using government authority just to the hilt. Just incredibly powerful figures, exactly as Frankfurter and Lippmann decades earlier had hoped but thought was unimaginable. And at that point, no one could imagine going up against Moses or Mulholland, right? Or Daley. They were unimpeachable figures. They were so powerful. And then, you have Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and the upset of the 1968 convention and Robert Caro writing about Robert Moses, and the zeitgeist changes again. And so now we're in a situation where 60, 70 years removed from that norm, where it seemed impossible that anyone would ever be able to poke an eye poke a finger in the eye of the establishment. Now no one can get anything done again. So we are vacillating from these two
Yeah.
extremes, and we just need to we need to correct again. So I am neither. I have a lot of hope about America in the sense that I think that once we recognize this challenge, progressives themselves will say to themselves, all right, who should make these decisions? And we'll begin building systems around that, just as we did in the 1970s in the other direction.
Ronnie asks, in the example you gave about the clean energy project for Massachusetts, why couldn't a cabinet department, such as the Department of Energy, create a special commission to gather the info, to hear the objections, and to make a decision?
It's an excellent question, and I hope he'll buy the book and he can read about all of the little picayune reasons that there you couldn't just sort of empower a commission to make this choice. It is largely because we've created a series of laws that give individuals, parties, the right to bring decisions to court. If someone claims that the way a study was done to consider the ups and the downs was insufficient or didn't consider this or that, they can come to court and then the judiciary decides whether the study was sufficient. This is why we have, 10,000, 20,000 page environmental impact studies on major projects, and they go on for years and years and years. It's not because people are not considering, it's not because we haven't empowered someone theoretically to make the decision. It's that the people who are theoretically empowered to decide, the head of the Department of Transportation or the governor or the mayor or whomever it is subject to all of these checks that we have woven into the system in subsequent years. Yeah.
Jeffrey in Wheaton, Illinois, Jeff asks, are there other countries getting this right? And are there lessons we can learn from them?
It's an excellent question. And the truth is that there are some things that they're getting right and some things that they're getting wrong. I don't know that there's any place that you would emulate just entirely. In Spain, for example, when you're doing a transit project, there is a national organization, the national government that does the planning and construction and then hands the project off to the local transit authority. In New York, by contrast, it is the local transit authority, and I think in LA as well, it's the locals who actually do the planning and operate it. And there is some advantage to having someone from outside who is not subject to the same pressures of local reticence about various concerns make the big decision. So like, there are elements of the Spanish system that you might want to impose. There are other things that are doing. There's a terrific project by the NYU. I used to work at the Marin Institute at NYU called Transit Costs. I think if you go to transitcosts.org and you see just how much more expensive it is to build in the United States versus other places. And they're trying to build out a series of best practices that explains why the Second Avenue subway in New York was so much more expensive than any similar project would be almost anywhere else in the world.
There's so many great viewer questions. I'll try and get to as many as I can. Joanne asks, given the total lack of trust in our country, it seems impossible to define common needs. So, how do you create trust, which Joanne sees as a key element of civic life and representative government?
So, in my view, again, I would turn it around. The moment the trust began to fall in American life was when the old system, where there were theoretically people who were in charge of things, began to change into one where who decides today? Like if you wanted to talk to the person who was going to decide about California high-speed rail, who would you go see? No one knows because there is no one to decide. Ultimately, right? Like the
Right.
governor has some role, the president has some role, the legislators have some role, Congress has some role, the Federal Department of Transport. Like who is actually in control of that? And in the notion that there is no one in control, people lose faith in government. So I would say that I'm switching the horse and the cart here. I think that if government were to re-empower individuals or commissions to make big decisions, faith would begin to emerge. That like that's who you go to talk to when you have a concern about this. And you're not going to get the outcome you want every time, but that's the person who's ultimately responsible.
You give an incredible example of the ice rink in New York that they totally redid with the new Freon-based technology, and it didn't work, and it sat there as an ice. It was sort of a symbol that New York couldn't do anything. And ironically, it was a local business person who agreed to take on the responsibility, came in with a cost much less than it would have taken for the public sector to do it. Share with us sort of the final irony of this story, please.
Well, I mean, this is the classic story. I mean, anyone who's seen Ghostbusters sort of has a notion of who Ed Koch was, who was the mayor of New York in the 1980s, and he had this exactly the Woolman Rink in Central Park. He was going to rip it up and make it better, and it was going to be on time and on budget, and they were going to say this. This is going to be an example of Ed Koch saving New York. And sure enough, he was over budget and took forever, all because progressive legislation passed generations earlier had made it impossible for him to bid out to a central a general contractor. He had to rebid to all these people. It would be a complicated mess. And you're absolutely right. A local businessman offered to just do it for him. I'll take it over. And who was the local businessman who did it on time and under budget? Donald Trump. And my view, that was 1984 and 1985. My view is that Donald Trump has been playing that same game for the entirety of his political career. He's seen that even progressives have lost faith in government. He's seen that ordinary people are just frustrated by the fact that government can't come to decisions, it can't broach compromises, it can't just push through the mishigas of public debate, and that he will be the decider, as George W. used to say. And that is his core appeal. And so that if we are going to successfully fight back against MAGAism, the first thing to do is to make government work, and then public trust in public institutions will begin to grow back.
We have about 2 minutes left, Mark. I want to get one more viewer question in from Miriam. How do you deal with projects, so many of which are long range in nature, while the decision-making process is a political one subject to relatively short-term election cycles? So, how do you solve that difference?
Yeah, I mean, these are great, very technical questions, but America has done this before, right? We built the highway system over the course of decades. In that case, there was a lot more power in the institutions of state highway departments. And in many cases, mayors and governors weren't satisfied with what these internal bureaucrats did. They didn't like the routes. They had their own issues, but they came and went, and the projects were bigger than any individual elected official. Again, there are disadvantages to that, right? You don't love the idea that there are bureaucrats who aren't ultimately accountable to elected officials, but you need some mechanism, and that's what I think progressives need to remember. We need some mechanism to make decisions.
Marc, we have about 45 seconds to wrap up. I'd love to hear just a closing thought, particularly, some positive solutions, some suggestions for how we break out of this.
In the 60s and 70s, we knew that there was something wrong. We knew that these powerful figures were unaccountable, and we've spent 50 or 60 years trying to fix that. We didn't have solutions per se in those moments, but we found mechanisms to just distribute power to ordinary citizens so they could protect themselves. We're in the same situation, but it's flipped now. And we don't have to have the answer in every case of how we're going to empower or who we're going to empower to make the decisions, but we do, as a collective movement, need to be thinking about who is it that we want to make big decisions for us, because someone needs to be empowered to do it.
Marc, thank you very much for joining us, talking about why nothing works, who killed progress, and how to bring it back. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to invite you to please financially support these programs. They're put on by the nonprofit Jews United for Democracy and Justice. Janice does such a wonderful job of curating these series of programs. And of course, your tax-deductible contribution goes right into the programs that you see virtually every Wednesday night, and with extra programs as well. You can make your contribution by going to the website jewsunitedfordemocracy.org. That's jewsunitedfordemocracy.org. And we thank you so much for thinking of these programs and supporting them. Also, I just want to remind you that next Wednesday evening, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, who I spoke with just yesterday on my radio program, Karen Bass will be with Madeline Brand for an hour-long conversation on immigration enforcement that has roiled Los Angeles, talk about President Trump's response to LA's pushback to the methods used in immigration enforcement in Los Angeles. That's next Wednesday, July 2nd at 5 o'clock Pacific. LA Mayor Karen Bass. From all of us at America to Crossroads, have a terrific evening. Thank you for joining us.